convention, known as the Final Fantasy XIV Fan Festival, or FanFest for short, is a celebration of the game and its players, but also where the news of the next expansion takes place. 3 FanFests are usually held before the new expansion, held in North America, Europe, and Japan in that order. And with the North American 2026 FanFest approaching, I'd like to revisit all the keynote announcements within the previous North American FanFests. Europe and Japan will get their own separate videos. This video should serve as what to expect during the North American FanFest. Now it needs to be mentioned that the FanFest announcing Heavensward and Stormblood were paid live streams and unfortunately no longer available. However, we still have screenshots of the slides and notes and overviews of the keynotes from various users summarizing these FanFests. Also note too that the FanFest that was supposed to announce Endwalker were all cancelled, as this was during the time of COVID. In its place was a single Digital Fanfest going over the information on Endwalker. However, before the Digital Fanfest, Endwalker also had an announcement showcase earlier that year with a ton of information on Endwalker. In every single North American FanFest so far, the keynote would start with the teaser trailer of the next expansion, with the first mention of the name of the expansion and the release window at the end of the trailer. Yoshi P would then start the keynote with where we're going for the next expansion, with key points for the next storyline. The 2014 North American FanFest confirmed Ishgard as the next location for Heavensward, pointing at the Dragonsong War and the conflict with Thordan as the key points for Heavensward. The keynote would then continue with the confirmation of the level cap going from 50 to 60. There was a bit of a joke that the new race for Heavensward was going to be the Vianga, a combination of the Viera and the Banga, although it was quickly dismissed. There was still going to be a new race for Heavensward, although no details were mentioned. Interesting to note that this FanFest was during 2.3, and so we were already introduced to Yugiri during the previous patch, and so many players assumed Yugiri's race would be the new race in Heavensward. New jobs were also confirmed for Heavensward, although no specific details were mentioned. This was also the first of the t-shirt hints for the upcoming expansion. And so the t-shirt Yoshi P was wearing at the time had a Batman logo on it, hinting at Dark Knight, that would later be confirmed in a future FanFest. New dungeons, new raids, and new trials would be confirmed for Heavensward, including a mention of a new original primal, exclusive to Final Fantasy XIV. However, again, no specifics would be mentioned at the time for the dungeons, raids, and trials. And finally, one of the last new pieces of content announced was the introduction of airships. Free companies will now be able to build their own airship, and new content will be introduced with the airships, which... yeah. The keynote concludes with a visual overview of the new areas in Heavensward. The 2016 North American FanFest would introduce Stormblood. This expansion confirms Alamigo as our next destination, highlighting the Alamigan resistance and their attempt to break free from the Garlean Empire. They would also introduce Xenos as one of the important characters within this expansion. It's interesting to note that the focus of this keynote was on Alamigo, and there was no mention of Kugane or the East in either the trailer or the keynote. The Far East would be the main focus of the next Stormblood FanFests. We see screenshots of the new hub, Ralgard's Reach. The level cap would be increased to 70. Again, new jobs, new dungeons, and new raids would be confirmed for Stormblood, with Yoshi P wearing a Scarlet Witch t-shirt, hinting at Red Mage, which would be later confirmed in a later FanFest. Eureka would also be announced, which would be similar to Diadem from Heavensward. A big overhaul was also announced for the skill system in Stormblood. Specifically, the cross-class system would be replaced with the role action system. Reassessment of unused and ineffective actions would also be taking place for Stormblood. We also hear about the long-awaited inventory expansion taking place for Stormblood. A 4th residential district was also announced, although no mention of where it would be until the next FanFest. And finally, the last announcement was the discontinuation of PS3 support for Stormblood. A PS3 to PS4 transfer campaign was held to help those transfer over to the new system. The 2018 North American FanFest is the first FanFest where live streams were free to view and luckily archived on their Twitch and YouTube channels. This FanFest announced Shadowbringers, which brought about a lot more questions than answers as it gave us questions on how we're supposed to bring down the Garlean Empire. This was during the time of patch 4.4, and so at this time, one by one the Scions were struck down with a mysterious sickness that would hinder the resistance against the Garlean Empire. Another key point of this FanFest was on the First Emperor, which was still a mystery on who this was at this time. Finally, they highlight how the Warrior of Light becomes the Warrior of Darkness, although it's still a mystery on why this is a case in terms of the story. There was no mention of the First or traveling to a different shard during this keynote. This would be later introduced in the future keynotes. Like with the previous keynotes, confirmation of the level cap going from 70 to 80, new jobs, new trials, new dungeons, and new raids would be confirmed for Shadowbringers. They would also introduce a new piece of content known as the Restoration of Ishgard. The trust system would also be introduced, which would help players play more solo style throughout the game and would expand to past instances later on. New Game Plus would also be announced, which gives players a way to replay the story without starting all over. And finally, the World Visit system was introduced, which allowed players to move freely between worlds on the same data center. The data centers for Europe and North America will also be regrouped for Shadowbringers. There was also a new race that was going to be introduced in Shadowbringers with the t-shirt hint of Bugs Bunny, which would later confirm Viera in a later FanFest. It's also interesting to note that after all the Shadowbringers announcements were done, this was also the keynote that announced Blue Mage as the new limited job that would be released before Shadowbringers. As mentioned before, there was only one keynote for Endwalker, and a lot of this expansion was already introduced in an announcement showcase earlier that year. It's also interesting to note that Yoshi P would walk out on stage after the trailer with artifact gear of the new job and introduced Reaper before going into the story key points. A thing to note was that the other new job, Sage, was already announced at the announcement showcase for Endwalker earlier that year. They would go over how Endwalker was the end of the Zodiark and Hydaelyn storyline, and the culmination of 10 years would come to the conclusion with Endwalker. They would show off new areas such as Old Sharlayan, Garlemald, and the Mare Lamentorium. They also introduced one of the new encounters known as the Magus Sisters coming in Endwalker, which is a reference to the Magus Sisters that would appear in several previous Final Fantasies, including Final Fantasy IV, which this expansion was based off from. Island Sanctuary would be announced as a unique piece of content for Endwalker. Data Center Travel was also announced for Endwalker, and the 24-man raid would be announced as an original piece of content known as Myths of the Realm, which would feature the 12 as the focus of the Alliance raid. Finally, Male Viera was also announced for Endwalker. And now we get to the 2023 North American Fanfests. Dawntrail would be announced as the new beginning for the Warrior of Light. They would also highlight the new world of Tural as the location for Dawntrail. The level cap would be going up to 100, and of course, new trials, new dungeons, and new jobs would be coming in Dawntrail, and like with the previous North American Fanfests, details of all of these would be later announced in upcoming Fanfests. The t-shirt hint Yoshi P gives us here is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which gives us a hint on Viper, which will be later confirmed in a later FanFest. Additionally, this time around, we actually get a reveal on one of the new trials, Valley Garmanda. Duty support would also be updated as well. They would also have a separate slide for new variant dungeons, new Alliance raid, new 8-man raid, and new Ultimate raids coming for Dawntrail. There is also a separate slide for ongoing content updates, which includes Hildebrand, Deep Dungeons, and the Gold Saucer, as well as Blue Mage, which, yeah. They would also go over the new graphical update for Dawntrail, which includes a change in the system requirements for Final Fantasy XIV, as well as more system updates, which includes the dual die system for gear, eyeglasses, furnishing limits, and the strategy board. Finally, the keynote concludes with the collaboration with Fall Guys and Final Fantasy XIV coming to Xbox. With all this in mind, we have a rough idea on how they will structure the next North American Fanfest. We'll see a teaser's trailer with the name of the expansion and a release window. We'll see key points of the new story, possible new jobs, confirmation of new dungeons, trials, and raids, and system changes. But we also have to take into account that with the recent interview with Famitsu, it's almost certain that we'll see a bit more news concerning the future of Final Fantasy XIV. It's possible that 8.0 will see a change in how the expansion will be structured, especially with the growing concerns of the game becoming a bit stagnant with some players. Regardless, the North American Fanfest often starts to bring the hype of the next expansion to the forefront and gives us a glimpse of what's to come and speculation for the next Fanfest before the next expansion.